Welcome back to the world of Eichard, where we learn how to think like the College Board. Today we're covering topic 7.1, shifting power after 1900. Here's the required content. This first part is basically just letting us know that everything we learned in Unit 6 continues and expands past 1900 until World War I in 1914. There are many examples of Europeans expanding their territory in Africa and Asia, and they also consolidated control over their existing territories. Meanwhile, economic imperialism by the United States continued to expand, notably with the creation of the Panama Canal. American economic influence was especially strong over its neighbor, Mexico. More on that later. This part, but both land-based and maritime empires gave way to new states by the century's end, is kind of a foreshadowing. We'll have to wait till Unit 8 to see the end of the maritime empires, but right now in 7.1 we have the end of 3 land-based empires, the Qing, the Russian, and the Ottoman. All of them collapsed due to both internal and external factors. All had autocratic governments, which was becoming less popular as Enlightenment ideals like popular sovereignty were spreading around the world. And in all cases, the government was largely corrupt, inefficient, and unable to adapt to new times. All 3 experienced significant rebellions, like the Taiping and Boxer rebellions against the Qing, the 1905 revolution in Russia, and the Balkan independence movements against the Ottomans. All 3 were large empires with diverse ethnic and religious populations, and faced resistance motivated by ethnic nationalism. We already saw the case of Slavic nationalism in the Balkans against the Ottomans. Various nationalist movements occurred on the peripheries of the Russian Empire, notably in Poland in the 19th century. In the Qing dynasty, many revolutionaries advocated for ending the rule of the ethnic Manchu in favor of the ethnic Han majority. Now, external factors. We've already seen China's disastrous defeats in the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese War in topics 5.8 and 6.4. We can also view this through the lens of the Qing dynasty being a victim of economic imperialism at the hands of the Western powers and the Japanese. More internal rebellions in the early 20th century culminated in the 1911 Xinhai Rebellion that finally ended the Qing dynasty, 276 years after its founding. And it was the end of more than 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. In 1912, the Republic of China was created, led by Sun Yat-sen, who declared the 3 principles of the people as nationalism, democracy, and livelihood. Sun's nationalism was not ethnic Han nationalism, but a Chinese nationalism that incorporated all ethnicities within the nation. The Balkans continued to cause problems for the Ottomans in the 20th century with the Balkan Wars, in which it lost nearly all of its remaining European territories. Biggest of all defeats was World War I. We'll talk more about World War I in the next video. Due to the victories of the Allied powers and the Arab Revolt, which was supported by the British, the Ottomans lost all territory except what is now roughly present-day Turkey, and the territory it kept was occupied by enemy armies. The Sultan became a puppet of the victorious Allies, until Mustafa Kemal, Ataturk, won the War of Turkish Independence and ended the Ottoman Empire in 1922, more than 600 years after it had begun. The Republic of Turkey was established the following year, a modern, secular nation-state with a representative parliament. The Ottoman and Qing empires kind of fizzled out at the end and ended up turning into republics, a type of government we've seen before. But the end of the Russian Empire was much more explosive. And it led to something entirely new, a successful communist revolution and the creation of a communist state. The biggest external cause was World War I again. The Russian army's performance in the war was abysmal. The troops were poorly supplied, often not provided with enough ammunition or even proper shoes. More than 2 million Russian troops died in the conflict. The war also exacerbated already existing economic difficulties, since so many supplies were being sent to the army, creating scarcity of basic necessities, such as bread. The first stage was the February Revolution, which began with protests of industrial workers, including many women and men, in St. Petersburg. They demanded an end to food rationing, end to the war, and end to autocracy. The protests were joined by soldiers who abandoned their posts to fight against the imperial regime. Tsar Nicholas abdicated and a provisional government was declared. But the provisional government was composed of mostly landowning aristocrats and bourgeoisie businessmen, and was regarded as illegitimate by the people. Instead, many people favored the leadership of the Soviets, revolutionary organizations that represented the interests of the workers and the peasants. The Soviets were dominated by the Communist Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin. The Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution, ending Russian participation in World War I, and after a bitter civil war, a new state was created, the USSR, the Soviet Union. Lenin instituted radical changes, seizing land of the nobility and church and money from banks and private companies and redistributing them to the peasants and workers, promoting atheism and Marxist education, emancipation of women that included easier access to divorce and legal abortion. We'll hear a lot more about the Soviet Union in later parts of Units 7 and 8. Now we have to talk about the Mexican Revolution, which challenged the existing social and political order, and arose as a result of political crisis. So first, let's talk about the existing social and political order. President Porfirio Diaz ruled Mexico for 34 years under the slogan, "Order and Progress." By order, he meant that he would provide security and stability, but it also meant brutally repressing any form of political dissent. By progress, he meant economic liberalization and industrialization. Under his rule, Mexico's GDP rose substantially as a result of large amounts of foreign investment from European countries and especially the United States into railroads, mining, and light industry. Diaz provided tax exemptions and other incentives to these foreigners, whom he called agents of progress. He also passed laws in favor of private ownership of land, which ended many centuries of communal ownership of rural peasants, including many indigenous communities. The people who benefited from these policies were the wealthy landowners, the middle-class bourgeoisie, and the foreigners. The people who suffered were the growing industrial working class and the poor peasants, the vast majority of the population. To overgeneralize, we can see Mexico's economy in the context of topics 6.4 and 6.5, as an export economy and a victim of economic imperialism. Many poor farmers went into debt to powerful landlords who put them in a state of debt bondage. Workers were largely unsuccessful in negotiating higher wages. In 1910, the revolution did not begin as a social revolution. It was a political revolution in protest of the 1910 election that was widely viewed as rigged in favor of Diaz. Diverse sections of the population rallied to elect Francisco Madero, and it seemed like change would finally come to Mexico. Revolutionary leaders like Emiliano Zapata in the south and Pancho Villa in the north wanted policies to address the extreme wealth inequality. Zapata and his disciples, the Zapatistas, especially wanted to address the problem of land ownership by redistributing ownership back to the peasants. But Madero was not willing to make many of these changes. He was forced to resign, and what followed was a long and violent struggle that caused at least 1 million deaths. In 1917, a constitution was created that included many of the land reforms that the Zapatistas had fought for. But many of these reforms were not actually put into practice until the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas in the 1930s. We'll talk more about Lázaro Cárdenas in topic 7.4. And that's all for topic 7.1. We'll see you next time to talk about World War I. Until then, keep thinking like the College Board.